And we are live here, back on Philosophy for the People, with my good friend, Gary Michuta, author of a million different books. He's got a new one out now called Revolt Against Reality, host of a really phenomenal podcast that people who tune into this channel, I'm sure, will be interested in, called Hands on Apologetics. So, Gary, thanks for being here. A little evening live stream. This will be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of wrote the book with mind to get on this show. So
this was it. This is the big moment.
This is the big moment. Yeah.
Well, I hope we don't blow it. Now this will be fun. I always love talking with you. In fact, I was on your podcast recently. In fact, why don't I know we usually save the plugs for the end, but let's put in some plugs at the beginning. You know, tell us about your show and what you do there, and because I really want people to check it out because it's awesome stuff.
Yeah, it's Hands on Apologetics. It's broadcast on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. So it is on radio, scattered throughout the country. But I think we probably get more listeners through podcasts. So basically, Catholic Apologetics show, and we cover everything you could think of, from theistic apologetics to Christian to Catholic apologetics, pseudo-Christian groups. And, I love having guests on. And you've been on a number of times. You're so gracious to come on. And we do some deep dives into theistic apologetics, and so it airs 1 to 2 Eastern, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 10 a.m., 11 a.m. Pacific Time.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link that in the show notes so people can hop right over there. Now, Gary, you have so many different books out on so many different things. You really are an awesome generalist, which I appreciate. But what actually got you in? First, let's take a couple step backs. How would you describe apologetics? And then what got you into apologetics? Because this is your full-time gig now. This is what you do. So I'd love to focus the first part of our conversation just on sort of the apologetic project, and then we can move into your book, and then we can maybe jam with the audience and do some Q&A at the end. So take us through that, your apologetics journey, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I define apologetics as the removal of intellectual obstacles that impede evangelization.
That's good.
So it's myths, misunderstandings, bad thinking. These things can impede somebody from embracing the fullness of truth in Christ and His church. And so basically, we try to use reason, history, logic, Bible, whatever tools to help clear up that stuff. That's how I look at it.
I think that's really good. Do you think then that this is the tool of apologetics? And is it who's it really aimed at? Do you think it's aimed at sort of the ideal agnostic? You know what I mean? It really is trying to help somebody who has a sincere barrier to entry, a sincere intellectual barrier. That's who we should be using apologetics on. Do you think it's useful for, say, the hostile skeptic, or I sometimes call him the dogmatic skeptic, right? Or is it just going to be a waste of time at that point?
Yeah, good question. I don't think it's ever wasted. When you have a dogmatic skeptic, so to speak, someone who willfully isn't open to understanding, if you don't present a case, they'll just assume no case can be made. So even if you present it and fail, at least they can't say, well, there's no reason or there's no arguments. But, the thing is, with apologetics, many times you're just planting seeds. And when you're dealing with supernatural material, it takes God's grace to gain an acceptance, and you might mention something or an idea, or maybe just give them a skill set that later on will help them ultimately embrace the fullness of truth. And I think so. In a way, we're kind of like handmaids. We're, giving them whatever we can. Or even better, MASH units,
Right.
We're on the field in the battle, and you try to patch people up the best you can and point them in the right direction to the hospital.
That's good. I like analogies like that. Okay, so back to you then. How did you end up in this wild and wacky world of apologetics?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't my idea. When I grew up,
it never is, right?
Yeah, my mom said never talk about politics and religion. So, of course,
now that's all you do.
That's all I do is talk. Well, not so much politics, but definitely religion. Yeah. I always was into philosophy, in high school. I thought that's where it was at. And it was, I grew up Catholic. I always stayed in the church, but I always thought church was kind of a esoteric thing that priests do, but it really didn't have to do with real life, like philosophy. That's kind of weird when I think about it now. But but anyway, so whenever I ran across some anti-Catholics, I dealt with them on a level of just logic and reason, because I didn't know nothing about the faith to, clear up on any other grounds.
Sure.
And, I'll give you the short version is ultimately I met a fundamentalist Baptist, and we couldn't agree on a lot of things. So one thing we could agree on was spiritual warfare. Started studying spiritual warfare with her. And, one day I was at my desk thinking about some of the things I was learning in spiritual warfare and how it was diametrically opposed to Catholicism, what I knew as Catholicism. And I just had this incredible experience of God and the real presence of the Eucharist that just spun my whole life around.
Wow.
And then after that moment, it was like, I want to learn as much about the faith as I can. I ran into Carl Keating's book, Catholicism, Fundamentalism. He was just starting Catholic Answers at the time. And I wrote him, said, hey, I want to do this stuff. This is awesome, because I didn't realize, there's reasons for what we believe as Catholics, historical, biblical stuff. So I actually started a 501c3 organization called Hands on Apologetics, nonprofit. That eventually, that lasted a number of years, but then I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to write books and do talks, because those are the things I like most. And
that's
also,
what you love doing.
And teaching classes too.
Yeah.
So.
Now you have definitely made a big name for yourself, really, as, I guess, can we say the Deutero guy, right?
The Deutero dude, yeah.
The Deutero dude, right? Where you really kind of, focused on the question of, like, why are Catholic Bibles bigger? Or maybe you could flip it and say, why are the Protestant Bibles smaller, or stuff like that. Right. But I want to expand that, because you're so much more than the Deutero dude. As people who follow your career know, you've got books out on many different topics. A really great book on Mary. So if anybody wants like a really great apologetic on Mary, what's the title of that one again? You'll have to remember.
Making Sense of Mary.
That's right. Making Sense of Mary. Yeah, really, really good stuff. I remember last time I was at your house, I just got to steal a bunch of your books, and that was a lovely treat.
Oh, I gave them.
Yeah. But
actually, I forced them on you, if I remember correctly.
No, not at all. But you've got a new book out. So tell us what this book is about, and tell us what inspired you to write it, and then we'll start diving into some of the material, if that sounds good.
Yeah, now that you open up all these doors. Yeah, in a way, I kind of wanted to break out of the deuterocanonical rut. I mean, it's great to be the guy for the topic, but you kind of get minimized into, that's basically your only sweet spot.
Yeah, you don't want to be, it's like the George Costanza effect, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You play that role, and then it's kind of stuck. You got to break out of it at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. That, and also it's just, the world seems to be getting exponentially crazy and insane, and so a couple of years ago, I through reading and doing apologetics, I always knew that there was some major influences that have affected, especially American culture. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should try to pull that together and look at the causes for the insanity today. Because the whole idea of the book was really to start a conversation among Catholics to say, this might be the reason why. This is how I see it. What do you guys think? Yeah. And so I basically took what our situation is today, and I kind of back-end engineered it backwards, to what is the causes of this, and then what was the causes of that. And I basically come up with a history of humanity, starting with the garden and all the way up till today. And hopefully, I think it has a lot of really good explanatory power, because I think my theory explains a lot of the things that have happened in history and when and why they happen. Yeah. And it also has some predictive power as well, because in my last chapter, which I title Reality Strikes Back, where I show like there's aspects of reality you can't dismiss, and they just keep coming to the forefront. Some of the stuff that I did in my manuscript a couple of years ago has today kind of like even went further,
Yeah,
so
right.
So it's like, okay, so there is something to my theory, because it has this predictive power.
Right, as all good theories must have, right? So okay, yes, something has gone seriously wrong with the world, and I think maybe it's worth reflecting on that a little bit, so that way we can kind of try and find the root, if you will. And I always love these types of puzzles. Like, how did we get here, right? Kind of like grumpy old man, get off of my lawn type of stuff, right?
Right.
But it's an important question. I mean, I saw recently on Twitter, of all places, there's a man who is convinced a number of people that he's a woman. And this is not an uncommon thing these days. Apparently, that people actually believe this. Like, I don't know if they really believe it. That's kind of the thing about insanity, right? Is like there's like this kind of like superficial belief, but I don't think it's ever sincere belief. I don't think, you know what I mean, unless like you're truly psychotic. But anyway, there's a man who's high up in the government who's somehow convinced a number of people that he is a woman, which he's not, and that this is somehow empowering to women. And I see something like that, and I say, that's insane. That is insane, right? And then there's a black woman, very competent, very smart, very accomplished, elected to public office recently, and I hear people saying that she's a white supremacist, and I say, that just sounds really strange to me, right? And then I see people talking about literally murdering innocent people, babies, and saying that this itself is another form of liberation. I think, well, that's insane too, right? So we just have insanity on so many different levels. Just moral insanity, insanity on human nature. You have people talking about there being no objective truths, or all truths are relative. So we've got deep philosophical insanity everywhere you look, Gary. Everywhere you look, it's insane, right? I don't know. What are some other examples?
Yeah, here's my favorite stock example is this, that you have, the second wave feminism, one of their main goals is to eradicate sexual stereotypes, that what makes a woman is doing girly things and wearing girly clothes, right? And then you have men who identify with women by engaging in sexual stereotypes, namely doing girly things and wearing girly clothes, marching in women's rights parades in order to eradicate sexual stereotypes. You almost need a map to figure that out,
It is insane, right?
Yeah,
it is insane. And like, I know it's not polite to call these things insane, but we care about trying to get things right here. So it is nuts. It's bonkers, and it's internally inconsistent, right? It's not just insane from our perspective. Like, internally, this doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, it's incoherent.
Yeah, so I don't know. Any other examples we want to throw out there? I mean, people can go through social media if they really need to, but I just want to I want to make sure the problem's very clear before we start to begin to diagnose it, right?
Yeah. And, the thing is, I think we do ourselves a disservice by looking at some superficial causes. Like, I think people would say, well, this is a problem of relativism, right? But, relativism is a symptom of a deeper cause. What is causing this relativism? Why is it that we have kind of lost our moorings or anchors into how things truly are?
Yeah, and it's always seemed odd just to say, well, it's the fault of relativism. Well, even if that's true to some extent, well, where did that come from? Right?
Yeah, right.
That couldn't have just sprung out of absolutely nowhere, right? Like, what's the root of that then? So I think you're absolutely right. We have to be patient here. We have to roll up our sleeves, and we have to try and really get to the heart of the issue. So, okay, good. Where do we want to start then? Because you throughout your really good book, and we'll make sure we'll link it and talk more about it at the end so people can get a copy. You take a good, broad and deep look throughout. And you kind of actually start way at the very, very beginning, right? With creation and the fall, or this or that. So you tell me, Gary, where do we want to focus the conversation today?
I really trace it back to the incarnation, because the idea that God has assumed to himself humanity, that the invisible has become visible, the infinite has become finite. That has radical implications that spark off all these intellectual revolutions throughout, Christendom, but ultimately form Western civilization. And then I thought, you know what? A lot of the things I'm reading actually sound like the serpent in the beginning, so I took it to the very beginning. But really, it kind of starts with the incarnation and how people kind of shrink back from the incarnation. And so I kind of I pick it up to there's these intellectual revolutions that occur that lift us high above like any other non-Christian worldview. Things that we take for granted, like hospitals,
Right.
the fact that we have free will, things aren't fated. Modern science, it provides Christianity, interesting enough, provides a realistic enough worldview in which you can do science, which all other religious beliefs don't have that capability. So I talk about Stanley Yaki's work and so on.
Right.
But I think, if you start following the thread, it goes into Islam. It's very interesting, Pat, because a couple of hundred years before Christ, Judaism encounters Greek philosophy. Okay. And what's interesting is there is a kind of compatibility between the two. In fact, if you look at the later book, the Deuterocanon, I can't leave that out of the discussion.
Of course not.
But what you find is that it elevates and is able to clarify revelation. So this faith and reason, even before Christ, is compatible. Now there was errors in Greek philosophy, right? And there were things that maybe weren't quite clear in Judaism, but there's compatibility. But when Aristotle comes into Islam and it encounters Islamic revelation, it's like a train wreck. Okay. There's some things that are compatible, but a lot that isn't. And this causes a kind of division within Islamic thought. And from that division, you have people who want to integrate and raise philosophy even above Islamic revelation. So they actually sound kind of Christian if you hear some of their ideas. And then there's the traditionalist who want to say that God or Allah is above reason. Allah and what they do is they separate the nature of God, the essence of God, from his will.
Right.
So Allah can do or declare anything he wants. He can call some murder evil, but then he can change his mind the next day and say it's good. And so it isn't that the God who is goodness itself, wills what is good and it becomes good. Under that kind of Islamic thought, it's God can will whatever he wants. And that destroys natural theology, right? We can't know God through his creation. And it ultimately centers on, it becomes a religion of the book, right? Because the only way you know Allah's will is by what Allah revealed, right? You can't use it, you can't use reason, you can't use natural theology or anything to kind of touch into that.
And that's always, kind of like surprised me how people wouldn't be more skeptical of that. Because if Allah's will is absolutely just, I guess, unhinged from anything else, then okay, maybe he revealed his will at a particular time, but who's to say he isn't going to change it 5 minutes from now?
Yeah, right.
Like, what sort of reassurance I have that this is in any sense binding? And in fact, it seems like by their commitments, it can't be binding, right? Because nothing can bind Allah's will, right? So like if that were my position, I would just be constantly on edge. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, sure. And even within Islam, I mean, they believe that there is verses in the Quran that have been abrogated, that Allah said something and then Allah changed it. And this has huge ramifications because it brings on what's called occasionalism, where there's no secondary causality. And so I love this one quote. This is from The Closing of the Muslim Mind by Robert Riley. He's quoting from Islamic scientist, I think in India. And he says, it's un-Islamic to say when you combine 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, that you get water. That's un-Islamic. What's Islamic is when you say, if you combine 2 parts hydrogen with 1 part water, by Allah's will, it becomes water. Okay. So, excuse me, hydrogen and oxygen by Allah's will becomes water. It could become a donkey or a gorilla or plutonium, if Allah wills it. So there's no secondary causality. And so, then reality kind of evaporates, right? Because what is real? Really, the only thing that is real is Allah. Right?
Yeah, and it's fundamentally irrational as well. So I mean, kind of contrast this maybe be helpful to contrast this with the Catholic position, which is well, actually, we can bring back into Greek philosophy, right? We can take like Euthyphro's Dilemma, right? So, famous kind of episode from Plato where there's this argument with this pagan priest named Euthyphro, and it has led to this what people think is an argument against God, but if you understand Plato, it's actually an argument for monotheism. So it's kind of funny. People think like Euthyphro Dilemma is a problem. It's like, actually, Plato solved that, right? Like that was solved with Plato. But anyways, the argument's, is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it's good? It was God's back then, but it's been transformed, right? And the idea of the argument is like neither of these are like seem like good options, right? Because one would seem to make morality almost entirely arbitrary, which is strongly not our intuition, right? We think that some things are like necessarily bad or necessarily good given the nature of certain things, right? The other would seem to say that there's something over and above God or controlling God. Now, the classical theist position, the Catholic position, is you go between the horns. God is the supreme good, right? It's just God's nature to be subsistent goodness itself. God is just, by definition and logic on classical theism, the moral standard, right? So, however, though, since God is perfectly good and is a perfect being, God's commands sort of flow from God's perfect rationality. So God has all possible powers of virtue of being omnipotent, but that doesn't include impossible powers like making square circles or making murder a good thing, right? Because that's literally nonsense, right? So in a sense, God is constrained, but it's not really constrained. It's really that just God is perfectly coherent, whereas the Islamic position really makes God incoherent, which is a privation. And in a sense, I think that, well, in that sense, we're not even really talking about God, because this is like we're attaching privations here, like the incoherence. Like this is not a good thing. Like if you list good things, you say, Gary, you're so strong, you're so muscular, and you're so incoherent, right? Clearly that last description like clashes with the other ones. That's not a good thing, right? That's not what we might call a great making property. So there's something really wrong, I would argue, with the philosophy of God here. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. I forget what we were talking about with that.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. That it's what they saw as freedom is really an attenuation of goodness, or lack of goodness,
right?
A privation, like you said. So and instead it was like, well, no, that's somehow you're not free if you can't be a little evil, I guess, or So what's interesting, I traced this history, and it ends up, there was a conflict between the Ludwig of Bavaria and John the 22nd, and it's this scorched earth policy that Ludwig engages against the Pope, and he wants to undermine papal authority and the church and put political power above religious power. So Ludwig enlists Marcellus of Padua and William of Ockham to his side. So he's got intellectual guns, and Marcellus is known for, he basically takes an avarice position where basically, it's the philosophy king who's in charge, who's concerned with philosophy and first things, and then religion is kind of just to confirm what the government, the authorities' power is. With William of Ockham, though, it's a very interesting story, because he was going to be on trial in Avignon, at the papal court in Avignon, and there were poor Franciscans there. The poor Franciscans believed that only absolute poverty was in line with the gospel, and they also were on trial. And so they enlisted Occam to defend their case. And Occam basically argued that that God could essentially change his mind. He can call something good in the Old Testament because property was legislated in the Old Testament, and he can change his mind. And so in the New Covenant, he could say that that same thing is evil. And ultimately what he does is he ends up with that kind of same Islamic idea that God is not constrained by his nature. And of course, as you know, with nominalism, and as I'm sure everyone watching your channel knows, Occam also denies universals, right? And what matters is the name you put on it. So God can change the name. So he, famously said that God could have crucified a donkey, and that would have sufficed to redeem the world because God would have called it, sufficient.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so again, it doesn't matter what the thing is in its essence. What matters is, this name or the will of God that kind of stamps it.
Right. The arbitrary decree.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that has huge ramifications for morality, natural law. It just, you can unpack
science
that.
As well.
Yeah,
of course,
absolutely.
right. Yeah.
Which is ironic because usually people say, nominalism helped the development of science because it kind of broke us from this Aristotelian handcuffs that people were in, which might be true, but in a way, I think it causes more harm than good. It kind of unmoors science.
That's right. It doesn't give us the grounds we need to make sense of science, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't give us what we need as a good philosophy of science. I mean, we need universals to make sense of generalizations. Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, I'm with you completely there. I think we need a sort of broad Aristotelian essentialism to help us make sense of not just, of course, the predictive success of science, but to really say that science does give us knowledge about the world. In fact, we kind of talked about this on your podcast recently, right? The various kind of like commitments that we need to have philosophically to really make sense of not just, again, the predictive success of science, but to say that science really does give us knowledge as well. And I think nominalism is going to undermine all of that completely, right? It's just going to be this fantastic mystery and miracle, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what most scientists are how they're going to want to think about what they're doing, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah. And ultimately, it actually undermines names itself because, and this is a problem for nominalism is. How is a name not a universal in a sense? Because the best they can say is, well, it's kind of like stuff, but there's no universal that binds everything in that particular concept.
Right, but to say that something is like or resembles something, resemblance is itself a universal. So you have this
exactly.
You have this famous regress problem to even try and get away from universals and just bring in something that is itself a universal. You keep sawing off the old branch you're sitting on, as they say, right?
Yeah. So anyway, Occamism becomes the what do I want to say? It's like the new learning in the universities. It's called the Via Moderna, the modern way, as opposed to the Via Antiqua, the way of Aquinas.
Oh, real quick here, by the way, I forgot, we're using terms here that people will not be familiar. When we say universals, we mean like general ideas, right? The one over the many, right? You have the particular instances like an isosceles or scalene triangle, but then we have triangularity as the universal or general idea. So there's going to be certain thinkers that Gary is identifying that are want to deny that there are universals or general ideas. And of course, you identified Occam. Hume was a big critic. In fact, he's the one who brings up these idea of the triangles, right? But anyway, sorry, continue. Just wanted to
so it's concerned with particulars, right? And what universals do is they show a commonality. So you have different kinds of triangles, but there's triangularity that's common throughout.
That's right.
So this becomes what's known as nominalism, right? Nameism. And that's where Martin Luther was imbibed with nominalism. And he's not thoroughgoing nominalist. There were things that in nominalism that were kind of Pelagian, meaning that you could kind of earn grace and things like that. But the overall view for Luther, and if you look at his theology, you can see, this is nominalistic. For example, how is a sinner made right with God? It's through a legal decree that God calls the sinner righteous. Now, the sinner's not righteous. The sinner is still unrighteous. He's damn worthy. But it's that legal decree, the name that God puts on him, that makes him righteous in God's eyes.
Right.
Right. So you can see that separation between, what God says and what is, or what is, and, our relationship to God.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what really is fascinating, I love learning the history of philosophy because, as we were mentioning before the show, in philosophy, in academia, you're thinking in purely abstract terms. But when that's brought into real life, it kind of takes on a different life of its own. And there's a kind of form that happens, a kind of pattern that exists. For example, in Islam, they become a religion of the book, the Quran only, although they have hadiths. In Protestantism, you have the Bible alone. You have sola scriptura.
Right.
You also have that you can't access the revelation except through experts. So you have the same thing there. Things tend to become particular. The particular becomes more important than the universals. And what happens is in Protestantism, they begin to splinter, right? And I think that's just part of the form of nominalism. It just tends to atomize things, break things apart. And that not only has important implications for religious groups, but for society as a whole, right? Because now society is being broken apart through this religious or philosophical worldview.
Yeah, isn't that interesting, right? The denial of these sort of these things that would unify universals, we have increasing division. It's just kind of an interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and so it's like whatever it touches, it tends to break apart. For example, like higher education. In medieval education, they was seeking a unity of knowledge, right? So all areas, natural science, philosophy, revelation, all of them were trying to see it as a coherent whole. And then when you get to the secular universities, then you start finding knowledge being broken apart into departments, right? And then you start having specialties within the departments. And then today, everything is so highly specialized. Somebody said, it's like we're learning more and more about less and less. And there's not any
until you know everything about nothing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's whatever it touches, it tends to take on that form, And so I trace it through there, and that has political implications. It has religious implications, all societal implications. And
this is really important, right? Because we often suffer and are suffering the effects of a long history of philosophical, frankly, bad philosophical ideas that we might be entirely unaware of.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And in fact, most people are. I mean, you mentioned nominalism to the man on the street. What are you talking about? Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But think about it. It's this whole sexual gender identity stuff. It's what you will. It's what you call yourself that matters, not what you are essentially.
Right. If you deny a sort of essentialism, right? I mean, like what makes a man and a woman? Well, the Aristotelian essentialist isn't it. They're not going to say chromosomes, right? I think that's a mistake, right? That's a property. Certainly, it flows from a particular configuration of being that is oriented towards a particular effect or range of effects in biological language, towards a particular biological reproductive role. And there's always going to be an ontological fact of the matter there, even if there's cases that invite epistemological blurriness because of disorders or something like that. And that's something somebody who's committed to essentialism can say that, and they have the philosophical muscle to say, no, you are a man. You are a man. And you can't just will yourself into a woman any more than we can will a square into a circle, right? Just reality is there, and it is pushing back on us. And God bless anybody who's struggling with disorders. Don't get me wrong. We always care about that, but we also have to believe that truth and charity, right, go hand in hand. And it is never a true act of charity to lie to people, certainly, right? To lie to people. So anyway, sorry, I had to
I mean, it really does splinter. In fact, the last couple of chapters were the hardest to write because it gets very dense, right? Because it has implications like the Supreme Court, legal positivism, whether an unborn baby is human or not is the decision of the mother, whether she wills it to be, whether, apart from ultrasounds or any, other data or whatever.
Right. It is this priority of just the will, right? Which is, of
Yeah.
course, deeply confused on many levels because the will is just a rational appetite. It's right. Intellect
Yeah.
is most fundamental, right? You can't even make sense of will apart from intellect. So,
Yeah. Now, that being said, I mean, that's a very fruitful line, but there's lots of other lines I trace in my book. You had classical theist on your program.
That's right.
Yeah, that was very good, and he made a good point that it's superficial to say everything's caused by nominalism alone. I think he made that offhanded comment, and it's true. There's a lot of other things too. For example, you mentioned Hume, so why don't we talk a little bit about Hume?
Yeah, my favorite.
Yeah, well, okay, starting with Martin Luther. Okay, Martin Luther denies the historic church. This causes him to, put him in a very, what do I want to say, dangerous position, because how can you argue that the church from the ages is wrong and you, Martin Luther, Augustinian monk, got it right? So he has to reimagine history. Okay. And this is the beginning of what's called no popery history, all sorts of historical myths, where basically it says Christianity was pure at the beginning, it became corrupted, and then Luther came and reformed it. That's kind of the shape of that new history.
Yeah.
And within this is all sorts of other denials in history. For example, one apologetic that Catholics made against Protestants was they appealed to miracles. They said, look, Protestants, we're in a church, the historic church. We have abundant miracles. They're always occurring, right? And what about you guys? And the reaction from Luther and other reformers was what's called cessationism, that what they argued was these are false superstitious miracles, because miracles happened in the New Testament. It happened maybe in the early church for evangelism, but the age of miracles stopped. Okay. And now, miracles really no longer happened. It's very rare that they do. Which isn't true, right? But it was a way to get out of that apologetic stranglehold. Well, anyway, that separation of two ages brings up Hume. Okay. It sets the stage for deism and Hume, because, Hume's one of his critiques of miracles is that they're so infrequent, right? And when they do happen, it lacks proper foundation or testimony. So it's always much more reasonable to believe that miracles don't happen at all than if they do. All of that was set up because of the cessation idea with the reformers. And what could they say? They kind of already conceded the whole case to Hume.
Right. Yeah. Isn't that interesting how so much of the sort of Protestant apologetic turned into the atheist and eventually new atheist apologetic? It really is kind of the same type of animal at the end of the day.
It just kind of changes with circumstances. Now, what I think is going on is that, they're trying to find a source of unity apart from the incarnation. Because it seems like the sacramentality, the physicality of Christianity in Catholicism was slowly being stripped away, and it's kind of a retreat. But to maintain unity, there's this source of trying to find unity apart from the incarnation. And so what you have is like little fix-its, right? I think that's what deism ultimately is. Deism was trying to unify everybody under a set of propositions. And then it's just a question, well, which propositions do you hold on to, right? And of course the number goes down because there's this ongoing reductionism, which is also kind of built into nominalism.
Right. Yeah, we need a great extension. Right? We got to include as many people in this as possible. So we got to keep bringing it down and down and down.
Yeah, and ultimately, it comes down to radical individualism that we experience today, and all sorts of things. But it's interesting to see how these different attempts at unity ultimately just end up dividing more and more.
Yeah. And the other thing is just how interesting it is. This is why I love not only your book is a great example of this type of stuff that I love, but I've mentioned before Mortimer Adler's 10 philosophical mistakes. And I think your books are similar because it shows how important studying the history, not just history, but the history of ideas is to understanding the world, because ideas have historical momentum. And that momentum carries even when people aren't always aware of the ideas that have been carrying through their entire life, their entire upbringing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And another factor that I think a lot of people miss, because you would expect that, well, shouldn't bad philosophy automatically give us feedback that it's wrong? You know, it's like,
I'm looking around, I'm seeing that bad feedback all day.
yeah, exactly. But it's like, okay, we can allow, let's take something extreme like abortion. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the sky didn't fall down. The West did not collapse. We just keep moving along, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what was going on, Pat, was people failed to realize that those intellectual revolutions that occurred from the incarnation
Mm-hmm.
created a kind of cultural momentum. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when Protestant comes on the scene and it rejects the historic church, things still continued. People were still generally moral. People still had a kind of Catholic worldview.
Mm-hmm.
As the centuries are going on, this cultural momentum is waning. Okay. So now it seems like changes are having bigger and bigger impacts.
Right.
In a sense, we kind of like went out on the edge of a branch.
Mm-hmm.
And today it's like, there's no more branch for us to stand on, because that cultural momentum has really waned.
Yeah, and quickly too. It's amazing. I mean, especially we've been talking about the gender stuff. I mean, like it's been around in various forms for decades, but to the extent that it's reached a popular level, things have changed drastically, I would say, in the past 2 to 5 years. I mean, just boom, like that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas you would have, talked like some of the people are talking now 5 years ago, people would have asked how you got over the wall at the asylum.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's accelerated. Like I said, it's kind of an exponential drop. And I think it's because that momentum is dropping exponentially.
Right. Yeah. So the momentum of these sort of bad historical ideas is carrying forward, but the momentum of the good, what we would say is the good preservative ideas, right, of Christian Catholic culture is increasingly waning, and we are definitely seeing the fruit of that. Right. We are.
Yeah. So, it was typical. I think people were waiting for the tipping point. It's like, things are crazy. Eventually, we're going to come to a point where everybody will see that how radically crazy this is, and we'll turn back. And I think what we missed is, no, what's going on here is that there's this momentum that's dying, and the more we're waiting for the tipping point, it's more of a, what do I want to say, a more it becomes like a whole systemic collapse within society. Like everything kind of flops, falls apart. Yeah. So so I ended the book pretty much there originally with like the darkest way you could possibly.
Right. Yeah.
I ended with the what we're experiencing now is an epidemic of loneliness. And it's actually becoming it's showing up on radar screens of governments. That's how bad it is.
Right.
That we're all isolated individuals in our own like bubble universes, right? With catered, bias confirming media outlets. And it's like we're so unconnected from everybody. Ironically, while technologically we're more connected than ever.
Yeah. Yep.
And
irony of ironies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was going to end it there, and I thought, no, I can't end the book like that. Right. So that's when I did the Reality Strikes Back at the end, kind of riffing off Star Wars, and just tried to look at, there's just some things you can't deny that is just still going to poke through no matter how you try to redefine it, sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. Well, that's what I kind of said at the beginning. Like, I don't know how real, this insanity is for some people. I mean, like, let's be honest. So much of it is just people conforming to social pressures, but like deep down, I know you don't really believe this stuff, right?
Well,
maybe you do. Maybe. But I don't think you do. Right?
Yeah.
I
mean, if you ever work for the coercive cults, there is a way in which you can make a thought system that will like literally imprison somebody within a system of thought.
Yeah. I know you
You know,
specialized in that too. Yeah.
yeah. So some of them may be experiencing that kind of entrapment. That unless you really believe it, it won't work. So
Sure.
the only solution is just to dive deeper into fantasy.
Yeah. That is a dark thought. But hopefully, yes, your book ends on a good note. I don't want to spoil right now, so we'll you know what? Let's take some questions. But
Okay.
before we do, Gary, where's the best place for people to grab a copy of this book? I want to make sure that they absolutely do that. It's and I was privileged to have an early look at it too. So it's definitely grab a copy. Where can they do so, Gary?
Catholic Answers you can get at shop.catholic.com or Amazon or any other book distributor.
Excellent. Very cool. All right, gentle listeners, if you have any questions or comments, now would be the time to submit it. We have the master himself and his apologetics dojo.
Yeah, the sensei is in.
The sensei is in. How many years in apologetics now, Gary?
Some's the early 90s. So
wow. Yeah, you're right there in the early scene. That's really cool. All right, comment here from Catholic Base says, I really like the turn to Islam. You don't really see many talk about Islamic thought. I'm glad to hear Mr. Michuta talk about this. His book is a must buy. Raving endorsement there from the customers. Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's one of those things where there's all these social pressures where just like you're not supposed to criticize gender theory, you're not supposed to criticize Islam as well. It kind of strange bedfellows, if you ask me, but it's there. But that's okay. We'll talk about what we're going to talk about. Here's a sort of unrelated but important apologetic question. Gary Counts says, Gary, how would you interpret the issue of genocide in the Old Testament? Have you tackled that before? So yeah, Gary, Bible difficulties. What's your general approach for some of these?
Yeah, actually, I have a little bit of that in my book because I cover all of human history essentially, and I think it's part of a rebuilding project on God's part. How it's according to the biblical record, after the fall, humanity like sinks like a stone. I mean, Adam and Eve's children was fratricide. Cain kills Abel, and so God has to make way for his definitive revelation of himself. So in order to do that, he instills some basic principles and kind of build from the beginning. They need to know calculus, but before they can get there, they need to know basic math, so to speak. In terms of interpreting genocide, my take on it is I believe that what appears to be genocide is actually a literary form. It's a form of warfare was used during the time period to describe military exploits and stuff like that. So it sounds like God is commanding people to wipe out whole people groups, when actually it's more of a command for destabilizing raids. Okay. And I think there's a reason on top of that. And the reason is because, God, or let me put it this way, Scripture has more than one sense. There's a literal sense and there's also a spiritual sense. So God can reveal stuff that literally happens, and there's also a spiritual sense that's built on the literal. Right. And I think God inspired the authors to write with this literary form because there is a spiritual sense that's being conveyed. Namely, like, for example, the Canaanites, the eradication of the Canaanites, in a spiritual sense, like the fathers of the church saw that as a kind of interior spirituality where, sinful tendencies or sinful thoughts or something are to be eradicated like the Canaanites.
Completely blotted out.
Yeah, so there's like a spiritual or moral sense that's going on too. Where if it was purely literal and they're talking about destabilizing raids and stuff, you wouldn't get that spiritual sense. Right. So instead they use a common literary form, which everybody reading it at that time would understand. Yeah, this isn't like word for word literal.
And understand as being hyperbolic as well, is my understanding, right?
Yeah. And there's a couple of books out that show that even if you take it literally as commands for genocide, and it says that they wiped all these people out, like in later texts, these people keep showing up.
They're still there. So like clearly
there.
it wasn't that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like, well, how do we reconcile that? And I think the literary form explanation is a good one.
Is it going? Yeah, I like that. That's really helpful, Gary. Thank you. All right, let's keep going here. Brendan says he ordered Gary's book. Well, that's awesome. You will not be disappointed. Revolt Against Reality. Thank you, Brendan.
Thanks.
Much appreciated. He says the things I've seen in the last 2 years is total bizarro world. Yeah, certainly has been, right?
Yeah, and I'm sure it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yep. All right, let's see here. Some questions. Brendan says, have you found yourself basically predicting what is next? Common sense reality to the fall. And if so, what would you imagine is the next basic concept of fall? Okay, yeah. So I guess it's a question about predictions, Gary. Like, what do we have to look forward to? Right? Because it seems like every 3 months we think, well, it can't get any more crazy than this, right? But then there's a way. And obviously we're not new in that, right? I mean, you go through various periods in American culture, various revolutions, including the sexual revolution. People recognized it at the time as being insane, right? On many fronts. And they thought like, this is like square circle stuff, right? But then it happened. And it just seems like we reach new, even more profound levels of insanity every 3 weeks. So yeah, Gary, what do you have here?
Yeah, I think that that form of nominalistic idea of atomizing everything down to individuals is going to continue. I think what's going to happen is you're going to start having systemic collapses. For example, right now, like gender language is being legislated into law. And experts in gender are still debating what they mean by gender.
Yeah, right? This is notorious in philosophy of gender. They cannot get a definition because if you refuse to bind it to biology, the problem is the definition is either going to be too expansive and you're going to include things into definition that these theorists don't want in there, right? Like if you just say like a woman is somebody who's suffered certain indignities, that's going to be way too expansive, right? Or it's going to be too restrictive and it's not going to include entities that these theorists want there. So this is like not only a notorious, I would say it's an in principle unsolvable problem, right? But they're already legislating it, right? Which is insane.
Yeah, they're writing laws with fill in the blank. It's like that's not a law.
It's so insane. You have no idea what you're even talking about, and yet you're making it law. Bonkers, right?
Yeah, and I think in the legal area, I think with feminism, I think all these things, I think the new essentialism is going to be a saving grace. I think eventually they have to anchor it into something solid, and it seems like essentialism is the right thing to do. Now, if they buy into essentialism, right, that things have essential natures, then teleology follows. Right. And then that means it has a certain pointedness, right, or directedness to it. And from that, you can get something like natural law. So I think we're in the terminal stages of insanity, God willing.
I hope so.
Because I can't imagine how more insane or incoherent it could be. But ultimately, you can't run a society, right, or a civilization with that much incoherence. Eventually it's just going to seize or break down.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And so hopefully we'll be able to turn back. And I think this is where all theists out there, especially Christian theists, especially Catholics, we can be beacons of light because we can show people, hey, this is the way to go, because at least now you can anchor it in creation. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny to see how people are really turning towards religion and tradition because they're terrified by the insanity. People who would otherwise never have paid attention to religion, Christianity, right now, like saying, well, this seems to be the only place where the sanity is to be found these days, right? The whole secular world is just it's clown world, right? And I think this ties into the next question from Luca here. How do we fight against this revolt against reality? Like what's the battle plan? And I'll just say one thing real quick is like, first off, just know you are not alone, right? That like the silent majority really is a big thing, but there's so many social pressures out there that want to make you feel marginalized. Like you're insane if you don't buy into the insanity. That's not true. You're not insane. They're insane, right?
Yeah, right.
They're insane. And you're not alone. It's just people need to be more courageous in speaking up about this sort of stuff, which is why I commend Gary so much for just being so forthright and just calling things as they are and writing an important book. Why I'm so happy to try and highlight it and get it out there. We need more people speaking up. And I think, fortunately, Gary, I think you're right. I think like people really are finally rising. It seems like the public sentiment has really kind of had enough on a lot of fronts. But the more people do that, I think the more empowered other people will become. My biggest thing is just, yeah, there is strength in numbers here. Make sure that you are making your positions known. It will attract other people. This will be empowering. We can have some organizational maybe push and force. So that's the one thing I would say, Gary, but really curious your thoughts on this. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, spoiler alert. One of the when reality strikes back is in the area of theistic philosophy. Pat, historically, like back when I was a kid going to community college, philosophy staffs were largely atheistic and like, grade Z, as far as scholarly rigor. Now theistic philosophers are out and they're rippling with brilliance. There's a huge comeback philosophically. And that's where I want to compliment you. The first thing you want to do is binge watch everything Pat Flynn has, okay? Because he's got lots of quality stuff. He's got, Gavin Kerr and Jim Madden, and, all these great philosophers out there. You even 10 years ago on YouTube, you would be hard pressed to find somebody outside of like a academic setting, right?
Sure.
To have a video. But now on the popular level, I mean, people are, engaging in some pretty high level thought and some very solid theistic ideas, philosophy, classical theism. John DeRosa, again, he has
good friend of the show.
Stuff.
Yeah, good friend. And
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reason to hope, and I think this is kind of a preparation for eventually, perhaps this insanity will eventually burn out through its own incoherence, and what's going to be left is stuff like this, like good solid philosophy, history, the historic church. I think that's what's going to be left standing.
Yeah, excellent. Well, boy, the hour has flown by. Let's highlight one more comment here because it's just such a well-deserved compliment. I'm glad to see this other side of Mr. Michuta, who knew he was more than a theological giant.
Yeah, physical giant too.
He is. Gary is a tall man. I've seen him, met him. I had the pleasure of dining with him numerous times. Gary, I mean, just you're such an asset. You're a great generalist, and get this book, ladies and gentlemen, Revolt Against Reality, but then go back through the backlog because there's so much good stuff there. Hostile Witnesses, love that one too. Yeah, that's a great one. So before we go, Gary, the hour has flown by. Just mention anything else, your show one more time, where people can keep up with you, and anything coming down the pipeline you want to mention for people to kind of
show Hands-On Apologetics, Virgin Most Powerful Radio. You can get it online. That airs live 1 to 2 Eastern time. What was the other one? Websites, handsonapologetics.com. Anything coming down the road? Well, right now I'm doing interviews on this book. I actually just turned in a manuscript for another book. I'll have to send it to you to get your.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
It's going to be called Message Received. How do we know that the Gospels are reliable? And so I'm going to kind of. I think I take somewhat of a unique look at some evidence, and the whole idea of the book is just to make the person say, wow, this is something really interesting, because if it's a fraud, it's a really, really over-engineered fraud. Like no one would go through the problem of that. So, and
Absolutely.
I also explain tradition as well. So,
wow, that I would love to take a peek at that and obviously have some conversations on that as well. So, as you know, Gary, you're welcome on the show anytime. It's a pleasure. This has been a blast. Revolt Against Reality, friends. Go grab it. Shop.catholic.com, and we'll see you on the next episode. Gary, thank you so much.